Emma Carter had been thrilled to buy the house. It was an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, a perfect fixer-upper with creaky charm. It had stood vacant for years, the neighbors said, though no one could quite remember why. For Ben and Emma, though, it seemed like a dream place to start their lives together. At first, things were normal. They spent their weekends unpacking, painting, and making the house their own. Every morning, Ben would run his hands over the cracked wooden banister as he descended the stairs, loving the old-world craftsmanship. Emma would hum softly in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, bathing the space in warmth. But on that chilly Sunday afternoon, when Ben first noticed the door at the end of the upstairs hallway, things began to change. It was the sort of discovery that sat wrong in your gut from the very beginning, though you couldn't quite say why. The hallway had always ended in a flat wall, Ben was sure of it. He'd walked down it 100 times in the few months they'd lived there. But now as he stood staring at the small wooden door, slightly ajar, it was as if something had shifted in the house, something subtle but undeniable. "Emma, you need to see this," he called out, his voice unsteady. And Emma hurried up the stairs, wiping her hands on a towel. When she saw the door, her brows furrowed in confusion. "Ben, that wasn't here before, I'm sure of it." They stood side by side, staring at the door, as if it might disappear if they looked away for too long. The air in the hallway had gone still, colder than the rest of the house. Ben reached out tentatively, his hand shaking, and pushed the door open wider. And the room beyond was impossibly small, almost claustrophobic. It was like any other room in the house. The walls were rough and unfinished, the floor bare dirt and the air damp with a musty, decaying smell. A single, dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak shadows that danced across the walls. On the far wall, smeared in what looked like red paint or blood, were the words, "Jagged out." A shiver ran down Ben's spine. His mouth went dry, and he looked at Emma. "What is this? Is this a joke?" And Emma shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but..." They slammed it shut and hurried back down the stairs, their thoughts racing. For the rest of the evening, neither of them spoke much about the room. They wanted to forget about it, pretend it was there. But it lingered in their minds like a shadow, nagging and persistent. And that night, they lay in bed in silence, staring at the ceiling. Ben's thoughts kept drifting back to that room. It shouldn't exist. How could they have missed it? What had been inside it before? Who had written those words? He tossed and turned, sleep evading him. Then, around 2 a.m., he heard it. A faint scratching noise, soft but unmistakable, coming from somewhere upstairs. Ben sat up, straining his ears. The sound came again, scratching, like nails on wood. Emma stirred beside him, groggily muttering, "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure why he said it. Grabbing his phone for light, he crept out of bed and made his way toward the hallway. The sound grew louder as he approached the mysterious door. The scratching was now frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Ben's hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but before he could touch it, the sound abruptly stopped. As silence filled the air, oppressive and heavy. The door, still slightly ajar, seemed to beckon him closer. He hesitated, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pushed him to open it. Slowly, he nudged the door open. And the room was just as they had left it, small, dark, and damp. But something was different now. In the center of the dirt floor, there was a deep, gaping hole. It was as though the ground had collapsed inward, revealing an abyss beneath the house. Ben knelt at the edge, shining his phone's flashlight into the hole. But the beam didn't reach the bottom. It was endless, a black void. A strange sound rose from the depths of faint whispering, like a voice carried on the wind. Ben's stomach churned as he strained to hear it. The voice was too low to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Malicious, angry. And suddenly something brushed against his arm, cold and fleeting. He spun around, but there was nothing there. His heart hammered in his chest, and he backed away from the hole, slamming the door shut. He rushed back to the bedroom, pale and shaken. Emma was sitting up, wide awake now. "What happened? What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. I don't know," Ben stammered, collapsing onto the bed. "There's something wrong with this house. That room, it's not natural." Over the next few days, the house's atmosphere grew suffocating. Shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners, and the air was thick with tension. They avoided the upstairs hallway entirely, but at night the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. Emma began hearing voices too. They were faint at first, whispers that seemed to drift through the walls, but as the days went on, the voices became clearer, calling her name in the dead of night. "Ben, it's the room," she whispered one morning, her eyes dark with sleeplessness. "It's trying to get to us." Ben wanted to dismiss it, tell her they were imagining things, but deep down, he knew she was right, as something had been awakened the moment they opened that door. Desperate for answers, they called a local historian to dig into the house's past. So when the man arrived, his face paled as he listened to their story. "This house," he said slowly, "was built on cursed ground. Decades ago, a family lived here, a family that disappeared without a trace. There were stories of a hidden room, but no one ever found it." Ben and Em exchanged horrified glances. "And I would advise you to leave," the historian added grimly. "Some things are better left alone." But it was too late. And that night, the scratching became unbearable. It wasn't just coming from the walls, it was coming from the floors, the ceiling surrounding them. And then, just after midnight, the lights flickered out. Ben grabbed his flashlight in Emma's hand and then was headed for the front door. But when they reached it, it wouldn't open. No matter how hard Ben pulled, it was as if the house itself was keeping them inside. Suddenly, from upstairs, the door to the strange room slammed open. A gust of icy air rushed down the stairs, and with it came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps descending toward them. "Run," Ben shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The lights flickered back on for a brief second, and in that moment, they saw it. A figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was small, twisted, and its face was contorted into a grotesque smile. Its eyes empty, hollow pits locked onto them as it began to move, slowly creeping down the steps, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. And then, the lights went out for good. 2 weeks later, the house was put back on the market. Another young couple came to view it, marveling at its charm. No one mentioned the strange room at the end of the hallway, because no one knew it existed. Or perhaps, no one was left to tell.